There are secrets in the Imperium that should never be known. There are truths so terrible that to possess them is to invite damnation upon your soul and those around you. I know these secrets. I carry these truths, and I will carry them to whatever end awaits me in the cold halls of Titan, Saturn's largest moon, where the fortress monastery of the Grey Knights stands as an edifice to mankind's eternal war against the darkness that lurks beyond reality itself. My name doesn't matter anymore. It was taken from me, or perhaps I surrendered it willingly. The details have grown hazy over the years, blurred by time and the psychic conditioning that keeps my mind fortified against the horrors I've witnessed. What I can tell you is this. I am one of the few unmodified humans who serves the Grey Knights directly, living among them in their basalt citadel, entrusted with knowledge that would earn most Imperial citizens a bolt round to the skull or a mind wipe so thorough they'd forget their own names. To understand what it means to be adopted by the Grey Knights is to understand the weight of the impossible. These are not the Space Marines you've heard whispered about in taverns or seen depicted in propaganda reels. These are the warriors that other Space Marines don't believe exist. Chapter 666, the Demon Hunters, the Sons of Titan. The living weapons forged from the Emperor's own genetic material, each one a powerful psyker, each one incorruptible in ways that defy the very laws that govern the warp itself. For 10,000 years, not a single Grey Knight has fallen to chaos, not one. In a universe where even the mightiest heroes can be corrupted, where Primarchs themselves have turned traitor, where entire Space Marine chapters have embraced damnation, the Grey Knights remain unblemished. And I live among them. I serve them. I know they exist, which means I know things that could doom entire worlds if they were to spread beyond these halls. The Inquisition enforces the Grey Knights' secrecy with ruthless efficiency. Imperial guardsmen who fight alongside them are typically executed afterward. Entire regiments have been put to the flame to ensure their silence. Even Space Marines who encounter the Grey Knights may have their memories scoured by telepathic means, their recollections of silver-armored warriors reduced to fragmentary dreams and half-remembered nightmares. The policy is clear. The existence of the Grey Knights is a secret that must be maintained at any cost, because to know of them is to know of the demon, and to know of the daemon is to risk corruption. But I know, I remember, and I am allowed to remember because my service requires it. I am one of the human scribes, the chapter serfs, the mind-conditioned servants who maintain the vast apparatus that keeps the Grey Knights functional. We are few in number, we who serve here. The Citadel of Titan is designed to house over 1,000 Space Marines and all their weapons of war, but most of the fortress stands empty, its halls echoing with silence and the whisper of ancient banners that commemorate battles no outsider would recognize. The Grey Knights are scattered throughout the galaxy, responding to demonic incursions wherever the prognosticars detect them, which means the fortress is maintained by a skeleton crew, servitors whose mechanical minds cannot comprehend what they witness, mind-wiped servants who perform their duties with blank efficiency, and those like me who have been deemed valuable enough to retain our consciousness. This is my life. This is my burden. This is my privilege and my curse, woven together so tightly that I cannot separate one from the other. And I will tell you what it truly means, because someone should know, even if this knowledge can never leave these halls, except as whispers and warnings to those who might one day stand where I stand now. The moment everything changed. I don't remember everything about my previous life. That's not entirely due to memory wipes, though those have certainly taken their share. It's more that the person I was before seems so distant now, so insignificant in the face of what I've become and what I've witnessed. But I remember enough. I remember the moment my old life ended and this new existence began. I was an administratum clerk on a world whose name I'm no longer certain of. My duties were mundane. processing cargo manifests, verifying tithing records, ensuring the proper forms were filed in the proper sequence. It was tedious work, the kind that ground down your soul with its repetition, but it was safe. Or so I thought. The demonic incursion came without warning, as they always do. One moment I was tallying grain shipments in the primary administratum complex, and the next the walls were bleeding, not metaphorically. The stone itself was weeping thick rivulets of blood that pooled on the floor and spelled out words in languages I'd never heard, but somehow understood in the deepest, most primal part of my brain. Words that promised things, terrible things, beautiful things, things that made my hands shake and my mind reel with possibilities I'd never imagined. I ran. Others didn't. I heard them screaming behind me, but the screams changed quality after a few moments, becoming something else entirely. Something that might have been laughter, or might have been worship, or might have been the sound a human throat makes when it's being restructured to accommodate different types of sounds. The Grey Knights arrived within hours. I learned later that the prognosticars had detected the incursion before it even fully manifested, had seen in their scrying that this world would be touched by the warp. By the time I stumbled into a shelter beneath the administratum complex, they were already purging the contaminated sections with flame and storm bolter fire. I saw one of them through a cracked door, just a glimpse, but it burned itself into my memory with perfect clarity. He was clad in silver ceramite armor that caught the firelight and seemed to glow with its own inner radiance. Seals and purity wards covered every surface, etched in acid and inscribed with words of power that hurt to look at directly. He moved with a grace that shouldn't have been possible for something so massive, his every step purposeful and economical. In his hands he carried a force halberd that crackled with psychic energy, its blade wreathed in silver flame. But it was his presence that truly struck me. I could feel him, even through the door, even though I possessed no psychic gifts of my own. It was like standing near a bonfire, that sense of warmth and power radiating outward, but this warmth burned away doubt and fear and weakness, leaving only clarity. He was anathema to the corruption that had seeped into our world. Where the demon's touch had promised pleasure and power and transcendence, this warrior offered only annihilation and absolute certainty. He found me. Of course he did. I was huddled in that shelter with 3 other survivors, all of us too terrified to move or speak. He opened the door, and for a moment, I thought we were dead. His helmet's eye lenses glowed with a pale blue light, and I could feel him looking into me, through me, examining every corner of my soul for the taint of chaos. "You witnessed them," he said. His voice was filtered through his helmet's vox speakers, but even mechanically distorted, it carried absolute authority. "You looked upon the Neverborn and did not break. You ran from their promises rather than embrace them." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up completely. All I could do was nod. "Stand," he commanded, and I stood. The others remained huddled on the floor, whimpering. "You will come with me. The others." He paused, and I saw his hand tighten on his weapon. "The others have been touched. I can see it in their souls. They heard the whispers, and part of them listened. They will receive the Emperor's mercy." I understood what he meant. The bolt pistol at his hip would grant that mercy, quick and clean. I wanted to argue. To say that we were all just scared, that we'd all heard those whispers and all fled from them equally. But I knew it wasn't true. I'd seen the way the others had hesitated before running. I'd seen the looks on their faces when the walls first began to bleed, that moment of awful wonder before terror took over. "Come," he said to me, and I followed. Behind me, I heard 3 quick shots, each one followed by silence. No screaming, no begging, just silence, and the knowledge that I had been spared for reasons I didn't yet understand. The battle lasted 3 more days. The Grey Knights were thorough, systematic in their purge of every contaminated sector. They moved through the city like a silver tide, burning and blessing and banishing, leaving nothing of the demonic taint behind. I watched from a command post they'd established. Too valuable to discard, but too potentially tainted to be left unsupervised. An inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus was there, a severe woman whose augmetic eye seemed to see through flesh and bone. She studied me like a specimen, occasionally consulting with the Grey Knights in a language I didn't recognize. When it was over, when the last demon had been banished and the last cultist had been purged, the Inquisitor turned to me with an expression I couldn't read. "You have seen too much," she said. "By rights, you should be dead. The Grey Knights do not leave witnesses. Their existence must remain secret, and the knowledge of demons is a corruption in itself." I said nothing. What could I say? "However," she continued, "you have also demonstrated remarkable resistance to the warp's influence. The Grey Knight psychers probed your mind and found it suitable, malleable but strong, aware but not broken. This is rare, exceptionally rare." She consulted a data slate, then looked back at me with her biological eye, the augmetic one, still focused on something I couldn't perceive. "You are being offered a choice, though understand, it is not truly a choice at all. You can serve the Grey Knights as a chapter serf, your memories and mind conditioned to withstand the knowledge you will accumulate. Or you can receive the Emperor's mercy here and now, your duty to the Imperium fulfilled, and your soul unburdened by what you've witnessed. Death or service. Service to the most secretive chapter in the entire Imperium, on a moon so hidden that its location was known only to the highest echelons of the Inquisition. Service that would require me to know things that drove most people mad. I choose service, I said, because what else could I say? I wanted to live. Even if that life would be lived in the shadow of things that shouldn't exist, surrounded by warriors who fought battles that could never be recorded in any history, I wanted to live. The Inquisitor nodded as if she'd expected this. "Then you will be taken to Titan. Your old life ends here. Your name, your family, your past, all of it will be placed under seal. You will be evaluated, conditioned, and if you survive the process, you will take up duties among the Fortress Monastery's staff. If you fail..." She didn't need to finish. Failure meant death or a mind wipe so complete, I'd be reduced to little more than a servitor, with flesh still on my bones. They loaded me onto a transport within the hour. I never saw my homeworld again, never learned what happened to it after the Grey Knights departed. For all I know, it was placed under quarantine, its population mind-wiped or purged, the entire incident erased from official records. That's how the Grey Knights work. They arrive, they purge, they disappear, and it's as if the demonic incursion never happened at all. The journey to Titan took weeks, or maybe months. Time becomes strange when you're traveling through the warp, even with a ship as heavily warded as a Grey Knight's strike cruiser. I was confined to a small chamber for most of the voyage, left alone with my thoughts and the occasional visit from a service girl that brought food and water. The solitude was absolute, broken only by the low thrumming of the ship's engines and the occasional shudder when the Gellerfields strained against something pressing at them from outside. I tried not to think about what was out there in the warp, in that roiling sea of madness and power that our ship was cutting through. But sometimes I could feel it, pressing against the edges of perception, whispering in voices that sounded almost like my own thoughts. That's when I would recite the prayers they'd taught me before we departed. Litanies of protection and clarity that helped keep my mind focused on the material realm. By the time we arrived at Saturn, I was half convinced I'd dreamed the entire thing, that I would wake up back in my administratum office processing grain shipments. But then the viewport opened, and I saw Saturn hanging in the void like a jewel, its rings catching the distant light of Sol, and I knew this was real. This was happening. My old life was truly over. Titan came into view slowly, emerging from behind Saturn's bulk like a secret being revealed. It was smaller than I'd expected, given the legends, but as we drew closer, I began to understand. The entire moon had been converted into a fortress. The surface was covered with defensive emplacements, macro cannons, and laser batteries pointing outward in every direction. Between them, carved into the dark basalt stone, were wards and sigils so large they could only be seen from orbit, psychic defenses that made my head ache even from this distance. And rising from the ice sheets and liquid methane oceans, jutting from the shadow of Mount Anak, like a blade thrust into the moon's surface, was the citadel, the fortress monastery of the Grey Knights. I had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. The Fortress of Secrets. My first impression of the citadel was one of overwhelming scale. The fortress was massive in ways that defied easy comprehension, a structure built not just to house warriors, but to contain secrets that could unravel reality itself. As the transport descended through Titan's orange atmosphere, I caught glimpses of the fortress's extent. Towers that rose like mountains, walls thick enough to house entire garrisons, courtyards that could swallow cathedral squares, all of it carved from dark basalt that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. The landing bay we entered was cavern-like, its ceiling lost in shadows far above. Row upon row of gunships and strike cruisers sat in silent readiness. Each one maintained to perfection despite the dust that seemed to coat everything in this place. Servitors moved with mechanical precision, performing maintenance rituals that had probably been unchanged for millennia. The air was cold, thin, tasting of metal and ozone, and something else I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't unpleasant, exactly, but it was alien, a reminder that this was a place apart from the rest of the Imperium. I was met by a chapter serf who introduced himself as Victus. He was old, far older than most humans I'd encountered, his face lined with decades of service. But his eyes were sharp and clear, and he moved with the economy of someone who'd learned not to waste a single motion in this place. "Welcome to Titan," he said without preamble. "I am to oversee your initial evaluation and conditioning. Follow me, and touch nothing unless instructed to do so." We walked through halls that seemed to stretch forever, corridors wide enough to accommodate space marines in Terminator armor, but mostly empty, echoing with our footsteps. The walls were decorated with battle honors, banners and pennants that hung from the ceiling in silent testament to victories won against enemies whose names I didn't recognize. Gold lettering faded with age inscribed each one, recording battles fought in places I'd never heard of against foes whose nature I could only guess at. "The fortress is mostly empty," Victus explained as we walked. "Most of the chapter is deployed throughout the galaxy, responding to incursions as the prognosticars detect them. At any given time, perhaps 1 or 2 brotherhoods are here on Titan, along with those knights whose duties keep them from the battlefield. The rest of us maintain the fortress in their absence." "How many of us are there?" I asked. "Human servants, I mean." "Fewer than you might think. The fortress is designed to accommodate over 1,000 Grey Knights and all their equipment, but the human staff number's perhaps 300. Servitors handle most of the mechanical labor, and many of our roles require little direct human involvement. Those of us who remain conscious and aware are here because we possess skills or knowledge that justify the risk of maintaining our memories." The risk. He said it so casually, but I understood what he meant. Every human who knew of the Grey Knight's existence was a potential security breach. A crack in the wall of secrecy that protected not just the chapter, but the entire Imperium from the knowledge of demons. We were useful, but we were also a liability that was merely tolerated. We passed through a massive doorway, engraved with the image of a sword piercing a book, the chapter's sigil rendered in silver inlay that caught the light. Beyond was a chamber that took my breath away. The room was circular, its walls lined with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, each one packed with books, scrolls, data slates, and objects I couldn't immediately identify. The ceiling was lost in shadows, but I could see platforms and walkways crisscrossing the space above, more shelves and storage visible on every level. "The Archivum Titanis," Victor said, something approaching reverence in his voice. "Every battle the Grey Knights have fought, every demon they've encountered, every ritual of banishment and exorcism they've performed, all of it recorded here. This is one of several such archives within the Citadel, each one containing knowledge that would drive most mortals mad. He led me through the archive to a smaller chamber beyond, this one clearly meant for processing new arrivals. A dozen other humans were there, all looking as lost and uncertain as I felt. Some were young, barely adults. Others were older, bearing the marks of prior service in the Imperium's vast bureaucracy. A few had the bearing of soldiers, though they'd been stripped of any weapons or rank insignia. "All of you have been brought here for evaluation," Victus announced to the group. "You have seen things you shouldn't have seen. You know things you shouldn't know. You have been offered service with the Grey Knights, and you have accepted. Now comes the difficult part, proving you are worthy of that service and capable of withstanding what it requires." He gestured to another serf who'd entered behind him, this one younger, but with the same sharp-eyed alertness that seemed common among those who served here. "You will undergo psychic screening to ensure you carry no taint of chaos. You will be examined by the librarians to determine the strength of your mind and your resistance to the warp's influence. You will be conditioned with litanies and prayers that will help fortify your thoughts against corruption, and you will be evaluated for your practical skills to determine where in the fortress you will serve." He paused, his gaze moving across each of us in turn. "Some of you will fail. The screening may reveal taint you weren't aware you carried, or weakness in your mental defenses that cannot be addressed. If this happens, you will be granted the Emperor's mercy or subjected to a mind wipe so thorough you'll remember nothing of your previous life. Those who succeed will join the staff of the Citadel, and you will spend the rest of your lives maintaining the fortress and supporting the Grey Knights in their sacred duty." The rest of my life. Here, on this cold moon, surrounded by secrets and shadows. Part of me rebelled at the thought, wanted to demand release or refuse this fate. But I'd made my choice back on that unnamed world when I chose service over death. There was no going back now. The evaluation process took days. I was subjected to examinations that probed every aspect of my body and mind, conducted by serfs under the direction of Grey Knights apothecaries, whose presence alone made my skin prickle with psychic pressure. They took blood samples, tissue samples, scanned my brain activity while showing me images that made me want to scream or weep or both. They asked questions about my past, my beliefs, my fears, recording every answer with mechanical precision. The worst part was the psychic screening. A Grey Knight's librarian conducted it personally, his presence in the examination chamber making the air feel thick and heavy. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there while I sat on a cold metal chair and felt him rifling through my memories like someone searching through old documents. I could feel him finding things I'd forgotten, examining fears I'd buried, testing the walls of my sanity by pressing against them with gentle insistence. When it was over, I was drenched in sweat despite the chamber's cold. The librarian spoke for the first time, his voice rich and resonant, despite the mechanical filtering of his helmet. "You are clean, remarkably clean, given what you witnessed. There is something unusual about your mind's structure, a natural resistance to warp influence that is rare among baseline humans. You will be assigned to the Archivum, working under Victus. Your conditioning will begin immediately." He left without another word, and I was taken to another chamber where the conditioning began. For 3 weeks, I spent every waking hour learning litanies of protection, prayers that the Grey Knights used to fortify their minds against the warp's influence. I learned the proper way to think about demons without giving them power, the mental exercises that would keep my thoughts clear and focused even in the presence of the Neverborn. I learned the hierarchy of the chapter, the structure of the brotherhoods, the proper forms of address when dealing with Grey Knights directly. It was exhausting in ways that physical labor never was. They were literally rewiring my mind, building new mental defenses and reinforcing existing ones, teaching me to think in ways that would keep me sane while handling knowledge that should have driven me mad. By the end of it, I could feel the difference. My thoughts had a clarity they'd never possessed before, a crystalline quality that made it easier to separate reality from the warp's lies. Of the dozen who started the evaluation with me, only 7 completed it. 2 were executed after screening revealed taint they didn't know they carried. 3 were mind-wiped and reassigned to servitor duty, their consciousness reduced to nothing but basic functions. I never learned what happened to them after that. The 7 of us who remained were sworn into service in a ceremony conducted by a chaplain whose skull-faced helmet and aura of absolute conviction made the experience terrifying and profound in equal measure. We swore oaths to the Emperor, to the Grey Knights, to the preservation of secrets that could never be spoken beyond these walls. We swore to die before betraying what we knew, to resist the warp's influence unto death, to serve with absolute loyalty until our final breath. When it was done, I was no longer who I had been. I was a servant of the Grey Knights, a keeper of secrets, a human among the demon hunters. I had been adopted, in a sense, taken into the fold of the most secretive chapter in the entire Imperium, and I would spend the rest of my life living with the weight of what that meant. Life in the Citadel. The Citadel of Titan operates on a rhythm different from any other place in the Imperium. There is no day or night here in any meaningful sense, as Titan's thick atmosphere and the fortress's deep halls make natural light a rarity. Instead, time is marked by shifts and duty rotations, by the sound of bells that echo through the corridors to signal various hours of service and devotion. I was assigned to work in the Archivum Titanis, as the librarian had indicated. My duties were straightforward in theory, but monumentally complex in practice, maintaining the records of the Grey Knights' battles, cataloguing new entries as they arrived from deployed brotherhoods, ensuring that the vast repository of knowledge about demons and chaos was properly organized and accessible when needed. The work required absolute precision. A misfiled report could mean the difference between a Grey Knight having the information they needed to banish a demon and walking unprepared into a situation that could cost them their life. Every entry had to be cross-referenced, every detail verified, every piece of information checked against existing records to ensure consistency and accuracy. Victus trained me personally for the first several months, teaching me the systems and protocols that governed the archive. He showed me how to read the various forms of Gothic used in different eras, as some of the records dated back nearly 10,000 years. He taught me how to recognize the names of specific demon entities without speaking them aloud or thinking about them too intently, how to handle texts that were themselves tainted by the subjects they described. Every word in this archive is a weapon, he told me one day as we sorted through a new batch of reports from the Third Brotherhood. Used properly, it gives our knights the knowledge they need to defeat the Neverborn, but mishandled, it can corrupt the reader or spread taint through simple exposure. You must always maintain mental discipline when working with these materials. Always. I learned to compartmentalize in ways I'd never imagined possible. When reading about a demon's nature or capabilities, I had to absorb the information without truly engaging with it on an emotional level, processing facts without allowing them to take root in my imagination. It was like learning to read a language while deliberately not understanding it, a delicate balance that required constant vigilance. The archive itself was a marvel. Shelves stretched in all directions, accessible via ladders and platforms that could be reached by mechanical lifts or spiral staircases carved into the basalt walls. Some sections were climate-controlled to preserve ancient parchments and books whose bindings crumbled at the slightest touch. Others were filled with more modern data slates and cogitator banks, their screens glowing with pale green light as they processed and indexed information continuously. There were rooms within the archive dedicated to specific threats. The Demon Principia contained comprehensive information on greater demons and demon princes, each entry painfully detailed. The Index Maleficorum catalogued specific chaos cults and their practices. The Tractatus Demonis held theoretical writings on the nature of the warp and chaos, philosophical and theological treatises that attempted to understand the incomprehensible. I was forbidden from entering certain sections without direct supervision from a Grey Knight's librarian. These areas, sealed behind doors marked with powerful wards, contained the most dangerous knowledge, true names of specific demons, rituals of summoning and binding that were recorded only so they could be recognized and countered, texts written by those who had fallen to chaos before being cleansed. To even look upon these materials without proper mental fortification was to risk corruption. My days developed a routine, though that word seems inadequate to describe existence in a place like the Citadel. I would wake in my small cell, barely larger than the bed it contained, and perform my morning ablutions before heading to the communal refectory where the human staff took their meals. The food was simple but adequate, designed for nutrition rather than pleasure. We ate in relative silence, as most of us were too tired or too focused on the day ahead to engage in idle conversation. After eating, I would make my way to the archivum, passing through corridors that never seemed quite the same twice, despite their unchanging architecture. The Citadel was vast enough that I could walk for hours and still encounter passages I'd never seen before, chambers whose purposes I could only guess at. I learned to navigate by memory and landmarks, following routes that became familiar through repetition. The work in the archive was absorbing in its own way. Each report told a story, though often fragmentary and coded. I would read about a Grey Knight's strike team deploying to a world I'd never heard of to combat a demonic incursion that had claimed thousands of lives. I would catalogue the weapons and tactics used, the rituals of banishment performed, the casualties suffered. Then I would file it away with hundreds of other similar reports, each one representing an incident that the rest of the Imperium would never know about. Sometimes the Grey Knights themselves would come to the archive, usually librarians seeking specific information about a threat they'd been assigned to combat. They would appear without warning, their presence immediately commanding attention, even if they said nothing. I would retrieve whatever texts or data slates they requested, careful not to make direct eye contact, speaking only when spoken to. They terrified me, those encounters, not because the Grey Knights were cruel or threatening, but because of what they represented. Each one was a living weapon, filled with psychic power that I could feel even when they were suppressing it. Being in their presence was like standing too close to a fire. That sense of heat and danger that made your instincts scream to back away, even as you forced yourself to remain steady. But I also felt something else in those moments: awe. These were the Emperor's finest demon hunters, warriors who had faced horrors that would break normal space marines and emerged victorious. They were incorruptible in ways that defied understanding, their souls so pure and their wills so strong that chaos itself could find no purchase in them. To serve them, even in this small capacity, was an honor that few humans could claim. The other serfs who worked in the archive became my closest companions, though we maintained a professional distance that was necessary given the nature of our work. There was Alethea, a former scribe from a cardinal world who specialized in translating ancient texts. She was perhaps a decade older than me, with a dry wit that occasionally broke through the solemnity of our duties. When we took our brief meal breaks together, she would sometimes share observations about the records we processed, always careful to speak of them clinically, without emotional engagement. "I've been here 12 years, she told me once, and I still find new patterns in the data. Did you know that demonic incursions follow tidal patterns based on warp currents? Not always, but often enough that the prognosticars can sometimes predict them months in advance." "How can the warp have tides?" I asked. "It's not a physical place." "It's not," she agreed. "But it has structure of a sort, flows and eddies that push things from one part of real space to another. The prognosticars chart these like ancient mariners charted ocean currents. That's how the Grey Knights always seem to arrive just as an incursion is beginning. They see it coming. Then there was Corvin, who maintained the cogitator systems and data slates. He'd been an Adeptus Mechanicus tech priest before. Something happened. He wouldn't talk about it, and I knew better than to press. But he was brilliant with machinery, capable of coaxing information from damaged or corrupted data slates that anyone else would have declared irretrievable. "The machine spirits here are different," he said once, while repairing a cogitator bank. "They're more aware, like they've absorbed something from the fortress itself. Sometimes I think they know what information I'm looking for before I ask for it." "Is that possible?" I asked. He shrugged, his mechadendrites continuing their delicate work. "Who knows? Everything here exists at the intersection of the material and the immaterial. The Grey Knights channel psychic power through their weapons and armor. Why shouldn't it affect the machines around them?" And there was Victus, always watching, always instructing. He'd served in the Citadel for over 40 years, longer than most humans could hope to survive in such proximity to forbidden knowledge. He'd seen Grandmasters come and go, had processed reports on battles that had shaped the Imperium's hidden history. He was a living repository of institutional knowledge, and he took his responsibility seriously. "Never become complacent," he warned me repeatedly. "The moment you start to think of this as just a job, as routine work, that's when the dangers become real. Every word you read could corrupt you if you let your guard down. Every report could plant seeds of temptation. You must maintain constant vigilance." I took his warnings seriously. I'd seen what happened to those who didn't. There were empty cells in the servants' quarters, rooms that had been occupied by people who'd failed to maintain their mental discipline. Victus never explicitly said what had happened to them, but I could guess. Some had been executed after showing signs of taint. Others had been mind-wiped and reduced to near servitor status. A few had simply disappeared, reassigned to duties that didn't require conscious thought. The Citadel had other staff beyond those who worked in the archivum. There were serfs who maintained the armory, ensuring that every weapon was blessed and ready for use. There were those who worked in the fortress's vast medici sections, assisting the Grey Knights apothecaries in treating wounded battle brothers and managing the chapter's gene seed. There were cooks in the refectorium, guards who watched over critical sections of the fortress, and hundreds of other roles that kept the machinery of the chapter functional. We rarely interacted across departments, as each section had its own duties and security clearances. But sometimes I would see them in the corridors or the refectory, and I would wonder what secrets they carried, what horrors they'd witnessed, or knowledge they'd acquired. We were all bound by the same oaths, all living in the same shadow, but our experiences within that shadow varied greatly. The servitors were everywhere, mechanical beings whose human origins had been all but erased by their augmentation. They performed the heavy labor, the dangerous tasks, the repetitive duties that didn't require conscious thought. Some had been criminals sentenced to servitude. Others had been chapter serfs who'd failed their duties or shown signs of instability. They were a constant reminder of what awaited those who couldn't maintain their mental fortitude in this place. Time passed strangely in the Citadel, without true days or nights, without seasons or weather beyond Titan's perpetual orange twilight, visible through the rare viewports. Weeks blurred into months, blurred into years. I marked time by the changes in my own capabilities, by the growing ease with which I could process disturbing information, by the increasing complexity of tasks that Victus assigned to me. After my first year, I was given access to the Daemon Principia, allowed to read and catalogue entries on specific greater demons under careful supervision. After 2 years, I could work independently with most of the archive's materials, trusted to handle information that would have destroyed my mind when I first arrived. After 3 years, Victus began training me to train new arrivals, passing on the skills and knowledge he'd accumulated over his decades of service. The work was never easy, but it became manageable. I learned to live with the weight of forbidden knowledge, to carry secrets that could never be shared, to function in an environment where a moment's carelessness could lead to corruption or death. I learned to recognize the subtle signs of taint in others, the small changes in behavior or speech patterns that indicated someone was struggling with their mental discipline. And I learned to appreciate the purpose behind it all. Every report I filed, every entry I catalogued, every piece of information I preserved was a weapon in the Grey Knight's arsenal. When they deployed to combat a demonic incursion, they did so with knowledge that I had helped maintain and organize. My work, tedious and dangerous as it was, contributed to their success in ways that most Imperial citizens could never imagine. I was part of something larger than myself, something that protected humanity from threats they would never know existed. It was cold comfort in the lonely hours of the night, when I lay in my cell and wondered what my life might have been if I'd never witnessed that demonic incursion, but it was comfort nonetheless. Understanding the Grey Knights. To work among the Grey Knights is to exist in constant proximity to beings who have transcended normal human limitations in ways that even other Space Marines cannot match. They are not merely transhuman warriors, not simply Space Marines with a particular specialization. They are something more, something that stands at the boundary between the material realm and the immaterium, warriors whose very existence is a rebuke to the warp's corruption. Every Grey Knight is a powerful psyker. This fact alone sets them apart from all other chapters, where psykers are rare individuals who serve as librarians, while their non-psychic brothers fight as normal Space Marines. Among the Grey Knights, there are no non-psychics. Every battle brother, from the newest initiate to the Supreme Grand Master himself, possesses the ability to channel warp energy and bend reality to their will. But they do not use this power carelessly or corruptly. Where other psykers must constantly fight against the warp's influence, struggling to maintain their sanity while wielding powers that could destroy them, the Grey Knights have achieved something remarkable. They have mastered the warp without being mastered by it. Their souls are so pure, their wills so strong, their training so rigorous that they can draw upon the Immaterium's power without succumbing to its corruption. I witnessed this firsthand on numerous occasions during my service. The Grey Knights would sometimes train in the Citadel's combat chambers, vast halls carved from the basalt beneath the fortress where they could practice without risk of causing damage to critical systems. Serfs were occasionally permitted to observe these sessions, as our duties sometimes required us to understand the Knights' capabilities and methods. The first time I watched them train, I understood why they were spoken of with such reverence by those few who knew of their existence. A squad of 5 knights entered the chamber, their silver armor catching the harsh lumens mounted in the ceiling. They carried their nemesis force weapons, psychically charged blades and halberds that crackled with barely contained energy. Their Justicar, the squad leader, called out instructions in a language I didn't recognize, though I later learned it was one of the many battle languages the chapter employed. They began with what appeared to be simple combat drills, moving through forms and strikes with mechanical precision. But as they moved, I could feel the air growing heavy with psychic pressure. They were channeling power even during basic training, practicing the art of weaving their psychic abilities into their martial techniques seamlessly. Then they began sparring, and the chamber erupted with light and force. Their weapons clashed with sounds like thunder, psychic energy flaring at each impact. They moved faster than should have been possible, each strike flowing into the next with perfect economy. And all the while, I could feel them communicating, their minds linked in ways that didn't require speech. They fought as one entity with 5 bodies, each knight knowing where his brothers would be before they moved, anticipating and supporting with preternatural coordination. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. These were warriors who could face demons in single combat and emerge victorious. These were the defenders that stood between humanity and the worst horrors the warp could produce. And I was permitted to witness them, to see them as few others ever would. But their psychic abilities were not their only distinguishing feature. Each Grey Knight had their body tattooed with the sigil of Malcador the Sigillite, acid etched into their left gauntlet and inscribed upon the flesh beneath. They carried copies of the Liber Daemonica on their breastplates, gnarled tomes bound in the thigh bone of martyred saints, containing the chapter's rites of battle and the cardinal tenets of law needed to combat demons. They wore armor that was more than simple ceramite. Their suits covered impurity seals and hexagrammic wards that served as both spiritual and practical protection against the warp's influence. Their names themselves were weapons. When a recruit completed his training and became a full battle brother, he surrendered his birth name and received a new one, a piece of magical law that worked in opposition to a demon's true name. Even something as simple as introducing himself could serve as a minor banishment, the syllables of his name containing power that pushed against the Imperium's corruption. Living among them, I came to understand their mindset in ways that few outside the chapter could. They were not simply warriors fighting a war. They were the war itself, their entire existence dedicated to a single purpose. They did not have lives outside of their duty, did not maintain hobbies or personal interests beyond what served the chapter. From the moment they were inducted as neophytes until the day they finally fell in battle, they were Grey Knights and nothing else. This singular focus manifested in ways both impressive and unsettling. I once witnessed a brother captain reviewing after-action reports in the Archivum, his helmet removed as he studied the data slates Victus provided. His face was scarred, marked by decades of battle, but his eyes held a clarity that was almost painful to meet. He read through descriptions of horrors that would have driven normal humans mad, his expression never changing, his hand never trembling. When he finished, he simply nodded, thanked Victus for the information, and left to prepare for his next deployment. No fear, no hesitation. Just absolute certainty in his purpose and capability. Their relationship with death was different from other Space Marines as well. Most chapters have elaborate traditions around falling in battle, viewing death in service to the Emperor as the ultimate honor. But the Grey Knights did not seek death or glory. They simply accepted that they would likely die fighting demons, that their end would come in some forgotten corner of the galaxy against an enemy that most of the Imperium didn't believe existed. When they died, they were brought back to the dead fields beneath the citadel, vast catacombs where every fallen knight was laid to rest. I was permitted to visit the dead fields once, accompanying Victus as he delivered records to be placed in the tomb of a recently fallen Grand Master. The journey down through the fortress's lower levels took nearly an hour, descending through passages that grew colder and damper as we went deeper. When we finally reached the fields, I understood why they were called that. The chamber was enormous, stretching so far in all directions that the walls were lost in darkness. Tombs lined the floor in orderly rows, each one marked with a plaque bearing the fallen knight's name and a statue depicting him in his armor. The air smelled of earth and stone and something else, something that might have been incense, or might have been the lingering presence of psychic power. It was a place of profound silence, broken only by the sound of our footsteps echoing across the stone floor. "Every Grey Knight wishes to be brought here," Victus said quietly as we walked between the tombs. "To be laid to rest among their brothers, their names carved into the walls of the fortress above. It's considered the greatest honor the chapter can bestow, to be remembered by those who come after." "How many are here?" I asked, looking at the seemingly endless rows of tombs. "Nearly 10,000 years worth of fallen knights," he replied. "Each chamber in the fields represents a century of service. We're in the 40th millennium now, so there are 40 such chambers, each one filled with heroes whose names will never be spoken beyond these walls." We placed the records in the Grand Master's tomb, a larger structure near the chamber's center. Then we stood in silence for a moment, paying respects to a warrior we had never known, but whose service had shaped the Imperium in ways that could never be publicly acknowledged. On the way back up, I thought about what it meant to fight and die in such secrecy. The Grey Knights achieved victories that saved billions of lives, yet they would never be celebrated for them. They faced horrors that would drive normal warriors mad, yet their courage would never be recorded in any history the Imperium acknowledged. They were heroes whose heroism must remain forever hidden, warriors whose greatest victories were also their greatest secrets. The Grey Knights maintained a rigid hierarchy, though it was different from other chapters. Instead of the traditional company structure, they were organized into 8 brotherhoods, each one led by a Grand Master and roughly equivalent to a standard Space Marine company in size. But the Knights didn't progress through these brotherhoods as they gained experience. Instead, each brotherhood had its own specialization and character, and a Knight might remain with the same brotherhood for his entire service. The first brotherhood, the Swordbearers, maintained the chapter armory and excelled in mechanized warfare. The second brotherhood, the Blades of Victory, specialized in rapid deployment and swift strikes. The third brotherhood, the Wardmakers, had produced many of the chapter's greatest heroes. The fourth brotherhood, the Prescient Brethren, contained the chapter's most potent psychers. Each had their own traditions, their own areas of expertise, their own legends. Above them all sat the Supreme Grand Master, the chapter's absolute leader, who could only be appointed by unanimous consent of all 8 Grand Masters. This position was held by Kaldor Drygo, though I learned he was rarely present in the Citadel. He had been dragged into the warp during a fateful duel with a greater demon and now wandered that realm eternally, occasionally returning to real space to fight alongside his brothers before being pulled back into the Imperium. His seat at the chapter's high table remained empty, a symbol of his presence even in absence. The Grey Knights also maintained special orders within their ranks. The Paladins were the chapter's most veteran warriors, each one having demonstrated exceptional skill and purity even by Grey Knight standards. The Purifiers were battle brothers whose souls burned so brightly that they could channel psychic fire that cleansed corruption wherever they walked. These warriors held ranks of immense respect and were called upon for the most dangerous assignments. Living among them taught me patience. The Grey Knights moved on timeframes that were often measured in decades rather than years. They would spend months preparing for a single operation, gathering intelligence and performing divinations to ensure the highest chance of success. They would wait years for the right moment to strike against a particular threat. They had no need to rush, no political pressures demanding quick victories, no competing priorities beyond their singular focus on combating demons. This patience extended to their interactions with us, the human servants. They were not cruel or dismissive, as I'd half expected before arriving. They simply operated on a level so far beyond normal human concerns that we were almost invisible to them unless our duties brought us directly into their path. When they did need to interact with us, they were professional and precise, wasting no words but never being unnecessarily harsh. I learned to appreciate the honor of serving them, even in my small capacity. Every report I filed might one day help a Grey Knight survive a battle. Every piece of information I organized might provide the key to banishing a demon. My work mattered, even if no one beyond the Citadel would ever know I'd done it. And slowly, over years of service, I came to understand that this was enough. That knowing I contributed to humanity's defense against the warp's horrors, even in the shadows, even in secrecy, was a privilege that few could claim. I was no hero, no warrior, no mighty defender, but I served those who were, and in serving them, I served the Emperor and the Imperium. That had to be enough, because it was all I would ever have. The weight of forbidden knowledge. The longest anyone had served as a conscious, aware member of the Citadel's staff was 73 years. His name was Erasmus, and by the time I met him, he was ancient beyond measure. His body kept functional only through rejuvenate treatments and augmetic enhancements that bordered on the excessive. He still worked in one of the fortress's libraries, though his duties had been reduced to simple cataloging tasks that required minimal interaction with corrupting material. Victus introduced us during my 4th year of service. I found Erasmus in a small side chamber off the main archivum, surrounded by stacks of parchment that he was slowly transferring to more durable data slates. His hands shook with palsy, and his eyes were clouded with cataracts, but his mind remained sharp. "So you're the new one Victus has been training," he said when we met, his voice rough with age. "How long have you been here now?" 4 years, I replied. 4 years, he repeated, a smile crossing his lined face. "Still a child, then. Do you know why I'm still alive? Why they haven't granted me the Emperor's mercy or mind-wiped me like they do with so many others?" "No," I admitted. "Because I learned the secret early on. I learned how to carry the weight without letting it crush me." He gestured for me to sit, and I did, curious about what wisdom this ancient might share. "Every serf who comes here thinks they can maintain their mental fortitude through sheer will. They think discipline and prayers and daily rituals will be enough, and for some, it is for a time. But eventually, the weight becomes too much. The knowledge accumulates, year after year, horror stacked upon horror, until the mind begins to crack under the strain." "Then how do you survive it?" I asked. "By accepting that you will never understand it all," he said. "By not trying to. You process the information, you file the reports, you do your duties with excellence, but you don't try to comprehend the full scope of what you're dealing with. That way lies madness. You maintain a professional distance, treating each piece of data as exactly that, data. Not truth, not horror, just information to be managed." It sounded like the advice Victus had given me, but coming from Erasmus, it carried more weight. This was a man who'd survived longer than almost anyone, who'd witnessed things I couldn't imagine, who'd carried secrets that most minds couldn't bear. "The other thing," he continued, "is that you have to find meaning in the small things. The routine tasks, the brief conversations with your fellow serfs, the moments of quiet in your cell before sleep. If you try to find meaning in the grand work, in the idea that you're helping save the Imperium or serving the Emperor's finest warriors, you'll wear yourself out. That meaning is too large, too abstract. It can't sustain you day after day, year after year. But the satisfaction of a job well done, of a report properly filed, of a brief laugh shared with a colleague, those small things can sustain you indefinitely." I took his words to heart. Over the following years, as I continued my service, I found that he was right. The weight of knowledge did accumulate. Each report I processed added another layer to the burden, another piece of information about the horrors that lurked in the warp and the terrible prices paid to combat them. But by maintaining that professional distance, by treating it all as data rather than as truth to be internalized, I could function without losing myself. The knowledge itself was staggering in its breadth and depth. The Grey Knights had been fighting demons for 10,000 years, and they'd accumulated information on thousands of specific entities, hundreds of types of demonic manifestations, countless corruption patterns and possession indicators. The Librarium Demonica, the foremost repository of warp lore in the entire Imperium, was housed somewhere deep within the Citadel, though I never received clearance to access it directly. But even the secondary archives where I worked contained information that could doom worlds if it spread beyond these walls. I learned the difference between the 4 ruinous powers, though I could never think too deeply about their natures. Horn, the blood god, whose demons manifested as creatures of pure rage and violence. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, whose servants were masters of sorcery and mutation. Nurgle, the plague father, whose corruption took the form of disease and decay. Slaanesh, the prince of excess, whose demons promised pleasure that destroyed the soul. Each had their own patterns, their own markers, their own methods of manifestation. A demonic incursion, bearing Khorne's touch, would be preceded by unusual violence and bloodshed, entire populations turning on each other in frenzies of murder. Tzeentch's incursions manifested with impossible phenomena: gravity reversals, time distortions, reality itself bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. Nurgle's touch brought plague and rot, diseases that defied medical explanation spreading with terrible efficiency. And Slaaneish's corruption came through temptation, promising transcendence and enlightenment, while slowly destroying everything that made its victims human. The Grey Knights had developed specific tactics and rituals for combating each type of demon. The information was detailed, technical, filled with terminology I had to learn through context and careful study. I read about Nemesis force weapons and how their psychic matrices were attuned to be particularly effective against demonic entities. I learned about the Aegis, the protective halo of psychic energy that surrounded each Grey Knight and provided defense against the warp's influence. I studied the 6666 rituals of banishment, each one designed to cast specific types of demons back into the Imperium. But the weight wasn't just from the information itself. It was from what that information implied about the galaxy we lived in. The sheer scale of the demonic threat was terrifying when you began to comprehend it. The Grey Knights, with all their power and skill and dedication, were spread thin across the Imperium, responding to threats that numbered in the hundreds or thousands at any given time. For every incursion they stopped, how many more went unnoticed until it was too late? For every demon they banished, how many more were waiting in the warp for their chance to manifest? The Imperium's policy of keeping knowledge about chaos secret from most of its citizens suddenly made more sense. If people understood the true scope of the threat, if they comprehended how thin the veil between reality and the warp really was, how easily corruption could spread, the resulting panic would be catastrophic. Ignorance was a form of protection, blinding people to horrors they couldn't fight anyway. But I knew. I and the other serfs, we carried that knowledge, maintained it, organized it, made it accessible when needed. And we paid the price for that knowledge in ways both obvious and subtle. Some serfs developed nervous tics, small repeated behaviors that helped them maintain their mental equilibrium. Others became obsessive about their routines, finding comfort in the predictability of their daily schedules. A few turned to prayer more than was strictly required, spending hours in the fortress's various chapels seeking solace from the Emperor. I noticed that I'd started mumbling protective litanies under my breath while working, my lips moving silently through prayers I'd memorized until they'd become automatic. The fortress had medici sections dedicated to treating psychological strain among the human staff. Every 6 months, we underwent mandatory psychological evaluations conducted by specialized serfs under the supervision of Grey Knights apothecaries. They would assess our mental stability, check for signs of corruption or incipient breakdown, and adjust our conditioning or treatment regimens as needed. During one such evaluation, the examiner asked me a question that stayed with me for years afterward. "What do you dream about?" she asked, her data slate ready to record my answer. I thought about it. The archive mostly, filing reports. Sometimes I dream about the knights, watching them train or preparing for deployment. Sometimes I dream about... I hesitated, unsure how to describe it. Sometimes I dream about things I've never seen, but that I've read about in the reports. Battles on distant worlds, demons manifesting, people dying. She made a note. "Do these dreams disturb you?" "Yes," I admitted, "but I don't think they're a sign of instability. I think they're just my mind processing what I encounter during my duties." "That's a healthy interpretation," she said, "but we'll monitor it. If the dreams become more frequent or more disturbing, or if you start having difficulty distinguishing them from waking memories, report it immediately." I assured her I would, but I understood the implication. Dreams were one of the ways corruption could first manifest, as the warp's influence seeped in through the subconscious mind, while mental defenses were lowered during sleep. If my dreams grew too vivid or too frequent, it might indicate that something was wrong, that taint had found a way in despite all my training and conditioning. The weight of knowledge also manifested in my relationships with the other serfs. We understood each other in ways that no outsider ever could, bound by shared experiences and shared burdens. But there was also a distance we maintained, a reluctance to become too close. We'd all seen what happened when serfs grew too attached to each other, when one failed and was executed or mind-wiped. The other often spiraled into instability as well. Alethea and I worked together in the Archivum for 8 years before I learned she had a sister who'd been mind-wiped and reassigned to servitor duty. She mentioned it once, casually, while we were cataloguing a new batch of reports. She was in the medici section, Alethea said. Showed too much emotional response to the injuries she treated. Started having nightmares that indicated she was developing sympathy for the suffering she witnessed. They caught it early, mind-wiped her before it could progress to full instability. "I'm sorry," I said, not sure what else to offer. She shrugged. "It's the risk we all take. She's still alive, still serving in her way. Just not aware anymore. Sometimes I see her in the corridors, one of the servitors performing maintenance tasks. She doesn't recognize me, doesn't recognize anything, but at least she's still useful to the chapter." The cold pragmatism in her voice was jarring, but I understood it. Emotional attachment was a luxury we couldn't afford. Not when our minds were already strained by the knowledge we carried. Not when instability could lead to corruption that endangered everyone around us. Yet despite all of this, despite the weight and the danger and the constant vigilance required, I never regretted my choice to serve. Because the alternative was ignorance, and having seen what I'd seen, having learned what I'd learned, I couldn't unknow it. Better to carry the weight with purpose than to have my memories erased and live in blissful ignorance of the threats that surrounded humanity on all sides. I was part of something important, even if that importance could never be acknowledged. Every day I served was another day that the Grey Knights had the information they needed to fight the Imperium's secret war. And that had to be enough, because it was all there was. When darkness comes to Titan, the attack came without warning, though in hindsight there were signs we should have recognized. The prognosticars had been agitated for days, their divinations showing disturbances in the warp that they couldn't quite interpret. Additional Grey Knights had been recalled to Titan, more than usual, their presence filling the halls with psychic pressure that made everyone's nerves feel raw and exposed. But no one expected the fortress itself to come under assault. I was in the Archivum when the alarms began. Not the simple bells that marked the hours, but a different sound entirely. A shrieking klaxon that cut through the fortress like a knife. Emergency lumens activated throughout the building, bathing everything in harsh red light. And beneath the alarms, barely audible, I could hear something else. Screaming. Victus appeared at the archive's entrance, his face pale but composed. "Defensive positions," he ordered. "All serfs to your assigned stations. This is not a drill." We'd trained for this scenario, though I'd never truly believed it would happen. The idea that anything could threaten the Grey Knights' fortress monastery seemed absurd. But as I moved to my assigned position, a fortified alcove near the Archivum's entrance, where I could assist with sealing blast doors if needed, I remembered something from the reports I'd processed. The Grey Knights had enemies, powerful enemies, who would pay almost any price for the chance to destroy them or corrupt the knowledge they guarded. The fortress's defensive systems activated with a thunderous roar that shook the walls. Macro cannons that had sat silent for decades or longer fired at targets I couldn't see, their reports echoing through the halls. Over the Vox network, I could hear terse commands being issued in battle cant, Grey Knights coordinating their response to whatever threat had materialized. Then I felt it. A presence, pushing against the edges of my mind, testing my defenses in ways I'd never experienced before. It was like standing too close to a fire, except the fire was inside my skull, burning at thoughts I didn't want burned. I immediately began reciting the litanies of protection I'd memorized, focusing my mind on the familiar prayers to block out the pressure. "They're here," Alethea whispered beside me. Her face was covered in sweat, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles had gone white. "The Neverborn. They're on Titan." The realization hit me like physical blow. Demons, here, in the Grey Knight's fortress. It shouldn't have been possible. The moon's defenses were among the strongest in the entire Imperium, second only to terror itself. The entire surface was covered in wards and hexagrammic sigils designed specifically to repel demonic entities. The Grey Knights themselves were the ultimate defense against such threats. Yet somehow, something had gotten through. The first demon I saw appeared in the corridor outside the archivum. One moment the passage was empty, the next there was a tear in reality itself, a wound in the fabric of space through which something pushed its way into the material realm. It was smaller than I'd expected from the reports I'd read, no taller than a human, but its presence was overwhelming. My eyes couldn't quite focus on its form, as if my brain was refusing to properly process what it was seeing. It had too many limbs, or perhaps too few. Its skin, if it could be called skin, shifted between colors that shouldn't exist, hues that hurt to perceive. It turned toward the archivum, and I felt its attention lock onto us like a predator spotting prey. Then it began to move forward, and I heard myself making a sound I didn't recognize, something between a whimper and a prayer. A Grey Knight appeared between us and the demon, materializing from one of the side corridors with his storm bolter raised. He didn't speak, didn't issue any challenge. He simply opened fire, and the demon shrieked as blessed shells tore through its unnatural flesh. Psychic energy flared around the knight like an aura, pushing back against the demon's corrupting presence. The demon lunged, moving faster than anything its size should move, but the Grey Knight was faster. His Nemesis Force halberd came up in a sweeping arc, the psychically charged blade cutting through the demon's torso. The creature didn't bleed so much as unravel, its form losing cohesion and dissolving back into the warp from which it had emerged. The knight immediately moved on, deeper into the fortress, toward where more enemies must be waiting. He hadn't even acknowledged our presence. To him, we were simply elements of the fortress to be protected, no different from the equipment or the archives themselves. "Seal the doors," Victus commanded, and I rushed to comply, my hands moving through the activation sequences I'd practiced countless times. Heavy blast doors began sliding shut at each entrance to the archivum, layers of blessed steel that would hopefully prevent any demon from entering the space. For hours we huddled in the sealed archive, listening to the sounds of battle raging throughout the fortress. The Vox network provided fragmentary updates, demon incursions in the eastern halls, heavy fighting near the Librarium Demonica, Grey Knight strike teams coordinating to push the invaders back. But the information was incomplete, filtered through battle cant and coded phrases designed to prevent corruption even in communication. The psychic pressure never fully abated. I could feel the demons out there, dozens of them, maybe more, their presence pressing against the wards and protections that kept the archivum secure. Several times I heard scratching at the blast doors, sounds that shouldn't have been possible from physical claws, but which somehow still reached through the blessed steel. Each time, I recited my litanies louder, faster, desperately reinforcing my mental defenses. Alethea broke first. She'd been standing near one of the sealed doors when something began whispering from the other side. I couldn't hear what it said, but I saw her face go slack, her eyes losing focus as she listened. She took a step toward the door, then another, her hand reaching for the unsealing mechanism. Victus reached her before I could, delivering a sharp blow to the side of her head that dropped her to the floor. "Get her away from there," he snapped at me, "and start a purification chant, full volume. Everyone who can still think clearly, join in." We chanted, our voices rising in unison to drown out whatever whispers were seeping through the doors. Ancient words of power that we didn't fully understand, but which had been proven effective at repelling the warp's influence. The sound filled the archive, echoing off the walls and shelves, driving back the pressure at the edges of our minds. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 or 6 hours, the all clear sounded. Different from the alarm, This was a series of chimes that indicated the immediate threat had passed. Victus waited several minutes longer before beginning the unsealing sequence, ensuring this wasn't a trick or trap. When the doors finally opened, the corridor beyond was scorched and scarred, the walls bearing marks where demon claws had scraped against blessed stone. Bodies of grey knights lay where they'd fallen, their silver armor rent and torn. More disturbing were the empty spaces on the walls where wards and purity seals had been, torn away or consumed by whatever corruption had manifested here. We emerged cautiously, moving in a group under Victus's direction. Other serfs appeared from their defensive positions, all of us shaken but alive, and everywhere we looked, we saw grey knights, some wounded but most intact, methodically checking every corner and corridor for any remaining taint. A chaplain appeared, his skull-faced helmet somehow both comforting and terrifying in equal measure. "Report casualties," he commanded, his voice amplified by external vox speakers. Victus stepped forward. 11 serfs unaccounted for from the archivum section. 3 confirmed instances of mental influence, including one prevented attempt to unseal our defensive position. All others appear stable, though we request immediate psychological screening. The chaplain nodded. "Begin preparations for purification rituals. Every space the demons touched must be cleansed and reconsecrated. Every soul that witnessed them must be evaluated." His helmet turned to scan across us, the skull face seeming to stare into each of us in turn. "You survived a demonic assault on Titan itself. Few can claim such a distinction. But survival is not enough. We must ensure you remain uncorrupted." Over the following days, the full scope of the attack became clear. A chaos cult had somehow infiltrated one of Titan's support stations, masquerading as Mechanicus tech priests for years while planning their assault. When the moment came, they'd conducted a massive summoning ritual, using stolen warp artifacts to tear holes in reality itself and allow demons to manifest directly within the fortress's outer defenses. It had been a coordinated assault, timed to coincide with the period when many of the Grey Knights were deployed elsewhere. The cultists had hoped to penetrate the Librarium Demonica, to steal or corrupt the knowledge held within. They'd failed, stopped by the Grey Knights who remained on Titan, and by defensive systems that activated automatically when demonic presence was detected. But the cost had been high. 37 Grey Knights had fallen, along with over 200 serfs and countless servitors. Entire sections of the fortress were so heavily tainted that they had to be sealed and subjected to months of intensive purification rituals. The cultists themselves had all perished, dying either in battle or through the automatic failsafes built into their summoning ritual, but their legacy of corruption lingered. I underwent 3 separate psychological evaluations in the weeks following the attack. Each time, a Grey Knight's librarian probed my memories of the event, examining my reactions and thoughts for any sign of taint. Each time I was found clean, my mental defenses holding despite the stress I'd endured. But I knew I was changed by the experience. I'd seen demons, not in reports or recordings, but in person, manifested in the material realm. I'd felt their presence pressing against my mind, testing my defenses, seeking any crack or weakness through which they could pour their corruption. And I'd survived it, held my mental ground through sheer force of will and the conditioning I'd received. But the memories didn't fade the way normal memories did. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that first demon, its impossible form burned into my brain with perfect clarity. Every quiet moment, I could feel the echo of that psychic pressure, that sense of something vast and terrible pressing at the boundaries of my consciousness. The litanies of protection became more than just routine. They became a constant necessity. Words I mumbled even in my sleep. Alethea was not as fortunate. She'd been exposed to the demon's whispers for too long, had listened to promises and temptations that left marks on her soul, even though she hadn't consciously accepted them. After her evaluation, she was taken away, and I never saw her again. Victus later told me she'd been mind-wiped and reassigned to servitor duty, her conscious mind erased to prevent the seeds of corruption from taking root. The Grey Knights lost more than just warriors in the attack. They lost serfs like Alethea, people who'd served faithfully for years, but whose exposure to the demons left them compromised. They lost sections of their fortress that might never be fully cleansed. They lost the illusion of perfect security that had made Titan feel safe, despite all the horrors we dealt with daily. In the aftermath, new protocols were implemented. Additional wards were inscribed on every surface, blessed by chaplains and empowered by librarians. Psychic screening for all serfs increased in frequency, conducted monthly rather than every 6 months. New defensive positions were established, with better equipment and more thorough training for the human staff. And we all carried the knowledge that we'd faced the Imperium's ultimate enemy and survived. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. It felt like we'd glimpsed something we were never meant to see, crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. We were alive, but we were also marked in ways that went beyond physical scars. I continued my duties in the archivum, processing reports with the same diligence as before. But now, every entry about demonic incursions carried additional weight, because I understood viscerally what those reports described. I knew the terror of facing such entities, the pressure of their presence, the corruption they represented. The information was no longer just data to be managed. It was reality I'd experienced, and that made all the difference. The passing years. Time on Titan moves differently than in other parts of the Imperium. Without natural days or seasons, without the rhythm of life that marks the passage of years elsewhere, existence becomes a blur of shifts and duties, of bells marking hours that all feel essentially the same. I stopped counting the years after my first decade of service. The number didn't matter anymore. I watched new serfs arrive and either adapt or fail. I watched Grey Knights depart for campaigns that lasted months or years, then return with fresh scars and new reports to file. I watched Victus grow older, his movements becoming slower, his voice becoming raspier, until finally he was granted the Emperor's mercy at the age of 68, his mind still sharp, but his body unable to continue its duties. Before he died, he requested that I take over his position as head archivist. It was an honor I accepted with mixed feelings. The promotion came with additional responsibilities and access to more sensitive materials, but it also meant I would be here even longer, carrying even more weight, becoming even more deeply enmeshed in the Grey Knights' secret war. I trained new arrivals the way Victus had trained me, passing on the skills and wisdom he'd shared. I taught them to maintain professional distance, to treat information as data rather than truth, to find meaning in small things rather than grand abstractions. Some listened and survived. Others didn't, their minds breaking under the strain or their souls showing signs of taint that required immediate action. Corvin served beside me for 17 years before he was killed during another demonic incursion, smaller than the first but no less deadly. He died defending the cogitator banks he'd maintained for so long, ensuring data integrity even as demons manifested around him. His body was recovered and given full honors in a small ceremony attended by the serfs who'd known him. We had no family to notify, no loved ones beyond the walls of the citadel, so we mourned him ourselves and moved on. New faces appeared in the archivum, young serfs who looked at me with the same mixture of fear and respect I'd once felt toward Victus. I tried to be patient with them, to remember what it had been like when I first arrived. But sometimes, the gulf between us felt too vast to bridge. They were still learning what I'd known for decades, still adjusting to truths I carried as easily as breathing. I watched grandmasters change as older warriors fell in battle, and new ones rose to take their places. I processed the after-action reports documenting their heroism and sacrifice, filing them away in the archives, where they would be preserved but never celebrated beyond these walls. Each report was a reminder of the war's scale, of how many battles were being fought while the rest of the Imperium remained ignorant. The fortress itself changed subtly over the years. New sections were added as the Grey Knight's needs evolved. Old sections were renovated or repurposed. The technology improved incrementally, cogitators becoming more sophisticated, weapons becoming more effective, armor gaining additional protections. But the core remained the same. The Citadel was a fortress dedicated to a singular purpose, and everything within it served that purpose. I grew older, my hair turning grey and then white, my joints becoming stiff despite the rejuvenate treatments that all senior serfs received to extend our usefulness. I developed a cough that never quite went away, a reminder that even with medical care, the human body has its limits. But my mind remained sharp, honed by decades of working with information that would drive most people insane. Sometimes I wondered what my life might have been like if I'd never witnessed that first demonic incursion, if I'd never been brought to Titan. Would I have remained an administratum clerk, processing cargo manifests until I retired or died? Would I have married, had children, lived a normal life in the Imperium's vast machinery? The thought seemed absurd now. That person I might have been felt like a stranger, someone who'd never really existed, except as a possibility that was never fulfilled. I also wondered about the other survivors from that first group I'd arrived with. 7 of us had completed the initial evaluation and conditioning. Of those 7, only 2 of us were still alive and conscious after 20 years. The others had died in service, or been executed for corruption, or mind-wiped after showing signs of instability. The survival rate was better than most groups, but it was still a stark reminder of the price we paid for carrying forbidden knowledge. My relationship with the Grey Knights evolved over the years. In the beginning, they'd been terrifying figures, warriors so far beyond human that I could barely comprehend their nature. After decades of service, they were still terrifying, but I'd learned to see them as individuals rather than as an undifferentiated mass of silver-armored demigods. There was Brother Captain Tharlus of the Third Brotherhood, who visited the Archivum regularly to research specific demon entities he was assigned to hunt. He was always courteous, always thanked me when I retrieved the information he needed, even though he didn't have to. Over the years, I came to recognize his particular gait, the way he held himself, the slight hesitation before he spoke, as if choosing his words with extreme care. There was Librarian Arcturus, who spent days at a time in the Archivum conducting research that I was not cleared to understand. He would request obscure texts and ancient records, spreading them across study tables and poring over them with intense focus. Sometimes he would ask me questions about the archive's organization or whether specific information existed in our databases. I always answered as accurately as I could, and occasionally I would see something that might have been approval in his body language. There was Grandmaster Voldus of the 8th Brotherhood, who I encountered twice in my entire service, both times in passing. His presence was overwhelming, psychic power radiating from him like heat from a star. But he'd nodded to me in acknowledgement both times, a small gesture that nonetheless felt significant, given the vast gulf between our stations. I learned to read the subtle signs that indicated which Grey Knights were veterans and which were newer to their service. The veterans moved with a particular economy, their every action refined to perfect efficiency through centuries of practice. Their armor bore more scars, more purity seals, more personal heraldry earned through battles that would never be recorded. They spoke less, their communications more clipped and precise, wasting no words because they'd long since learned exactly what needed to be said. The newer knights, those who'd been inducted in the last century or two, still retained traces of individual personality that the veterans seemed to have worn away. They would occasionally engage in brief conversation beyond the strict necessities of their duties. They showed more emotion in their body language, though still far less than normal humans. They were learning to become Grey Knights in the fullest sense, and watching that transformation over decades was both fascinating and sobering. I also came to understand the rhythms of the chapter's operations. There were periods of intense activity when multiple brotherhoods were deployed simultaneously to combat widespread demonic incursions. During these times, the archivum would be flooded with incoming reports, and we would work extended shifts to process the information as quickly as possible. Then there would be quieter periods when most of the chapter was on Titan, conducting training and maintenance, preparing for future deployments. These were when the fortress felt most alive, when you could hear Grey Knights moving through the halls, when the training chambers echoed with the sounds of practice combat, when the chapels filled with warriors at prayer. The prayers were particularly striking to witness. Grey Knights at prayer were not like other warriors of the Imperium. Their devotion to the Emperor was absolute, but it was channeled through their psychic abilities in ways that made the air shimmer with power. I watched one such prayer session from a distance once. A full brotherhood gathered in the Mandulian chapel, and the psychic resonance was so strong that I could feel it even through the walls. It was like standing near a generator, that sense of vast power being contained and directed toward a specific purpose. Through it all, I maintained my duties with the same diligence Victus had taught me. I processed reports, organized information, trained new serfs, coordinated with other sections of the Citadel to ensure smooth operations. The work was endless, but it was also purposeful in ways that transcended personal satisfaction. Every task contributed to the Grey Knights' effectiveness, and their effectiveness protected the Imperium from threats most citizens would never know existed. I also began contributing to the theoretical sections of the archive, writing analytical papers on patterns I'd noticed in decades of processing reports. I observed that certain types of demonic incursions tended to cluster geographically, suggesting that weaknesses in real space's fabric might be location-specific. I documented correlations between warp current fluctuations detected by the prognosticars and the severity of subsequent manifestations. None of this was groundbreaking research, but it added to the body of knowledge that the Grey Knights used to anticipate and combat threats. One of my papers was actually read by a Grand Master and incorporated into the training curriculum for new Grey Knights. I was informed of this by a chaplain who thanked me for my contribution to the chapter's effectiveness. It was perhaps the proudest moment of my service, knowing that something I'd created would help future warriors in their sacred duty. But pride was always tempered by the knowledge of cost. For every victory documented in the archives, there were casualties. For every demon banished, there were Grey Knights who fell in battle. For every world saved, there were others that were lost before help could arrive. The war against chaos was unwinnable in any traditional sense. The best we could hope for was to hold the line indefinitely, preventing the warp from consuming everything. Living with that knowledge, carrying it year after year, required a kind of fatalism that wasn't quite despair, but wasn't quite hope either. It was acceptance of the universe as it was, rather than as we might wish it to be. The Grey Knights embodied this acceptance perfectly. They knew they were fighting an eternal war against an enemy that could never be fully defeated. They did it anyway, with absolute dedication, because the alternative was to surrender humanity to horrors beyond imagining. And I served them in this, my small contribution to an infinite struggle. It wasn't much, perhaps. I would never fight demons personally, never stand on the front lines, never face the warp's terrors directly as the Grey Knights did. But I would maintain the knowledge that helped them fight more effectively, preserve the records that ensured their victories weren't lost to time, and train the next generation of serfs who would do the same after I was gone. That had to be enough, because it was all I could do. The final service. I am old now, far older than I ever expected to be. 53 years of service to the Grey Knights, a lifetime spent in the shadows of the Citadel, carrying secrets that have grown heavier with each passing year. My body is failing, despite the best efforts of the apothecaries and the rejuvenate treatments they've provided. My hands shake too much for detailed archival work. My eyes, even augmented as they are, struggle to focus on the data slates and ancient texts. My cough has progressed to something the medici staff describe as manageable but irreversible. I know what this means. I've seen it happen to others, including Victus and Erasmus before me. When a serf can no longer perform their duties effectively, they become a liability. The knowledge we carry is too dangerous to let exist in minds that might be failing or compromised. There are only two possible outcomes: a mind wipe so thorough that I'll retain nothing of my service here, or the Emperor's mercy, delivered quickly and cleanly. I find myself hoping for the latter. After carrying this weight for so long, the thought of having it removed but continuing to exist as a blank shell holds no appeal. Better to end with my memories intact, to die knowing what I've contributed and what I've witnessed, than to live on as something less than what I've become. The decision will be made by the chapter council, I'm told. They will review my service record, assess whether the risk of leaving my knowledge intact outweighs any potential future value I might provide. It's a cold calculation, but I understand it. Everything the Grey Knights do operates by this same logic. What best serves the chapter's mission to combat demons? While I wait for their decision, I've been assigned light duties in the Archivum. I help train my replacement, a younger serf named Marius, who shows promise and dedication. I pass on the wisdom I accumulated over 5 decades, the small tricks and insights that make the work more manageable. I tell him about Victus and Erasmus and the others who came before, ensuring that their legacy continues, even if their names will never be recorded in any official capacity. The weight never gets lighter, I tell him one day, as we're organizing a new batch of reports. But you get stronger. Your ability to carry it improves with time and experience. Don't try to bear it all at once. Take it day by day, shift by shift, and trust that you'll develop the capacity you need. He nods, solemn and attentive. He's already beginning to understand what this service requires, though he won't fully comprehend it for years yet. That's how it works. Understanding comes gradually, built from accumulated experience rather than sudden revelation. I also spend time in the dead fields, walking among the tombs of fallen Grey Knights. I've never been permitted to be buried here. That honor is reserved for the warriors themselves, but I find peace in this place, surrounded by silent witnesses to 10,000 years of sacrifice. Each tomb represents a hero whose heroism can never be celebrated beyond these walls, a warrior whose victories will never be recorded in the Imperium's official histories. But they're remembered here, their names carved into basalt walls, their deeds preserved in the archives I helped maintain. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the truest heroism is the kind that requires no acknowledgement, that serves simply because service is needed. I think about the person I was before I came here, that administratum clerk who processed cargo manifests and lived in comfortable ignorance of the universe's true nature. That person seems impossibly distant now, separated from who I've become by decades and experiences that changed me fundamentally. Would he recognize me if we could somehow meet? Would he approve of the choices I made? I think he would. Faced with the same decision, service or death, I believe he would choose service, just as I did, because ultimately, we're all part of something larger than ourselves. The Imperium, for all its flaws and brutality, represents humanity's attempt to survive in a galaxy that wants to destroy us. And the Grey Knights, secretive and terrible as they are, stand as one of our strongest defenses against the darkness. My contribution to that defense has been small, almost invisible in the grand scheme of things, but it was real, and it mattered. And I take comfort in that knowledge even as my body fails and my time grows short. Last week, I was called before the chapter council. I entered the chamber where the 8 Grand Masters and various senior officers gathered to make decisions regarding the chapter's operations. They sat in high-backed chairs arranged in a semicircle, their armor gleaming in the harsh lumens, their presence so overwhelming that I had to fight the urge to fall to my knees. The Supreme Grand Master's seat remained empty, as it always did, a symbol of Kaldor Draego's perpetual absence. but his presence was felt nonetheless, in the devotion of those who served under his nominal command, in the standards that bore his heraldry. Grandmaster Callistus of the Sixth Brotherhood, who served as High Seneschal of the Citadel, spoke for the council. "Archivist," he said, his voice resonant and formal. "You have served this chapter with distinction for 5 decades and 3 years. Your loyalty and dedication are without question. Your contributions to our understanding of demonic patterns and corruption indicators have proven valuable in numerous operations." I remained silent, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. "However," he continued, "your physical condition has deteriorated to a point where continued service in your current capacity is no longer feasible. The Council has reviewed your record and considered various options for your final service to the chapter." This was it then. The decision had been made. "You are granted the Emperor's mercy," Callistus said, his words formal but not unkind. "You will be permitted to set your affairs in order over the next week. A chaplain will attend to your spiritual preparation. When you are ready, you will be taken to the Dead Fields, where your service will be concluded with honor and your body laid to rest, alongside those of chapter serfs who have similarly served with distinction." For a moment, I couldn't process what I'd heard. Laid to rest alongside other serfs meant they weren't going to mind-wipe me. They were going to let me die with my memories intact, with full knowledge of what I'd done and what I'd witnessed. It was more than I'd dared hope for. "I am honored beyond measure," I managed to say, my voice rough with emotion I rarely allowed myself to feel. "To have served this chapter, and to be granted such an ending. Thank you." "The honor is ours," another Grandmaster said. I think it was Voldus, though my vision was blurring and I couldn't be certain. "Few humans could have endured what you have endured, or served as faithfully as you have served. Your name will be recorded in our archives, alongside the others who have given everything to our cause." They dismissed me with formal courtesy, and I left the chamber in a daze. I'd been expecting death, had prepared myself for it, but somehow the reality was different from the anticipation. I had 1 week to conclude my affairs, to say whatever farewells needed saying, to make peace with my life and my choices. I spent the time well. I finished training Marius, ensuring he understood not just the mechanics of the archive, but the philosophy behind it, the mindset required to survive this service. I wrote final notes on several ongoing research projects, documenting my conclusions and recommendations for future analysis. I spoke with the other long-serving serfs, sharing memories and commiseration with those who understood what this life had meant. And I prayed, more than I had in years. Not for salvation or divine intervention. I was long past believing the Emperor intervened directly in individual lives, but for acceptance, for peace, for the strength to face my end with the same dignity that the Grey Knights showed in facing their own mortality. The chaplain who attended my spiritual preparation was patient and thorough. He heard my confession, such as it was, and granted me absolution for whatever sins I'd accumulated over the decades. He recited prayers that reminded me of humanity's place in the universe, of the eternal struggle between order and entropy, of the sacrifices required to maintain civilization against the forces that sought to tear it down. "You have seen what few ever see," he told me near the end of our sessions. "You know the truth that most must be protected from. In knowing this truth and yet maintaining your service and your sanity, you have accomplished something remarkable. The Emperor's grace has been with you, whether you always felt it or not." I wanted to believe him, though I'd never been particularly religious beyond the basic devotions required of all imperial citizens. But in this place, in this moment, his words carried weight. Perhaps the Emperor did watch over those who served in the shadows. Perhaps my survival and service were evidence of something beyond simple luck or stubborn will. The final day came faster than I expected. I woke in my cell for the last time, performed my morning rituals with extra care, and dressed in the simple robes I'd worn for decades. I ate a final meal in the refectory, surrounded by faces I'd come to know well over the years. Some nodded to me in respect. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the reminder of mortality that my presence represented. Marius found me before I left for the dead fields. He said nothing, just placed a hand on my shoulder in silent acknowledgement. It was enough, more than enough. The chaplain came to escort me, along with a small honor guard of grey knights. This surprised me. I hadn't expected any ceremony beyond the bare minimum. But apparently, the council had decided my service merited this final honor. We walked through the Citadel's halls one last time, taking the long path through the sections I'd come to know best over the decades. The journey down to the dead fields felt different than my previous visits. This time, I was walking to my own interment, to the end of a life lived in shadows and secrets. The air grew colder as we descended, the walls pressing in around us as we moved deeper into Titan's rock and ice. When we reached the fields, I saw that a small section had been prepared. Not among the Grey Knights' tombs, those were reserved for the warriors themselves, but in an adjacent chamber where chapter serfs of particular distinction were laid to rest. There were dozens of markers here, hundreds perhaps, commemorating humans who'd served the chapter faithfully over 10 millennia. My name would be added to their number. It was a legacy I could accept. The chaplain performed the final rites, prayers for the dying that the ecclesiarchy had refined over thousands of years. The Grey Knights stood at attention, a small honor guard witnessing my final moments. And I knelt before them all, accepting the Emperor's mercy with gratitude and peace. The bolt pistol's report was the last thing I heard, a single shot that ended my service and my life in the same instant. And as darkness claimed me, my final thought was one of satisfaction. I had served, I had endured, I had contributed something meaningful to humanity's defense against the darkness. That was enough. That was more than enough. Epilogue. The archives of the Grey Knights contain millions upon millions of entries, each one documenting battles fought, demons banished, worlds saved from corruption. Most are written in formal military language, dry reports that catalogue events without emotion or embellishment. But occasionally, very occasionally, there are entries of a different nature. Buried deep in the Archivum Titanis, accessible only to those with the highest clearances, there exists a small subsection dedicated to chapter serfs who served with particular distinction. These are not extensive records, merely names, dates of service, and brief descriptions of their contributions. But for those rare humans who carried the weight of forbidden knowledge for decades, who maintained their sanity and dedication despite being surrounded by horrors that could destroy stronger minds, there is at least this acknowledgement. One such entry reads, Archivist, name sealed, served 53 years, survived demonic assault on Titan, reference, Incident Sigma 7, contributed significantly to theoretical understanding of demonic incursion patterns, trained 14 replacement archivists, of whom 7 survived to take permanent positions, granted Emperor's mercy, full honors, body interred in serfs' fields, Section 22 Gamma. It's not much, a few lines of text in an archive that most humans will never know exists, but it represents a life of service, of sacrifice, of dedication to a cause that required secrecy, even as it demanded everything. And throughout the Citadel, in archives and armories and training chambers and 1,000 other locations, there are others like this individual, humans who chose service over ignorance, who accepted terrible knowledge so that the Grey Knights could fight more effectively, who lived and died in shadows so that others might live in light. They are the unseen servants of humanity's most secret defenders. They are the adopted children of the Grey Knights, taken in and trained and used and ultimately disposed of when their service reaches its natural end. They receive no statues, no songs, no celebrations. Their names are known only to those who work beside them and those who come after. But they serve nonetheless, because someone must, because the war against chaos requires more than just warriors wielding blessed weapons. It requires support staff and administrators and archivists and 1,000 other roles that humans can fill, even if it costs them everything to do so. This is what it means to be adopted by the Grey Knights. This is the truth that few will ever know, and fewer still will understand. It is service without glory, sacrifice without recognition, dedication that burns away everything else until only purpose remains. And in the endless war against the darkness that presses in from all sides, perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the truest heroes are those who serve in silence, whose contributions will never be celebrated, but whose absence would be catastrophic. Perhaps the greatest honor is to know that you mattered, even if no one else will ever know you existed. The Grey Knights stand as humanity's shield against the warp's corruption. But behind that shield, supporting it, maintaining it, are humans like those I've described. Ordinary people who became extraordinary through their willingness to bear impossible burdens. And as long as the war continues, as long as demons threaten the Imperium, there will be others like them. Choosing service over safety, knowledge over ignorance, purpose over comfort. They are the adopted children of the Knights of Titan, and they deserve to be remembered, even if only in records that will never be made public, even if only in stories that can never be openly told. If you found this deep dive into the lives of those who serve the Grey Knights in silence compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. Share it with fellow Warhammer 40K enthusiasts who appreciate the darker, more complex aspects of the lore. And if you have thoughts on what it might be like to serve the Grey Knights, or your own theories about the human servants of the chapter, leave a comment below. Until next time, may the Emperor protect.